What we are going to cover today, we're going to start off with a little discussion of property values and taxes. We are about a month out from having received the preliminary controller values, and the weather has had an impact on the property value study process. So I'll talk a little bit about that. We've got some update on TEA guidance. If you've been too busy to catch up on things, we'll have a very brief little discussion of that as well. There's some new information that just came out yesterday, as a matter of fact. And then we're going to talk about the legislative session. If at any point, Connie, I don't know if you or Oscar will interrupt with questions, but if you feel appropriate, I'm flexible. So by all means, do that. Just don't ask me about the cost of the electric grid, because I won't know that one.
Yeah, that was a guessing game for everybody, but we'll do that too.
I kind of know who's going to pay one way or the other, though, right? Okay, property value study. Preliminary values were released back at the end of January, which is the traditional time for that to happen. House Bill 3, of course, switched us to using current year property values, and many of you are finding that that has created some new issues with projections. We'll come back to that topic in just a little bit. So these values are the ones that ultimately will be used in the 2021 school year funding calculations. But of course, we won't know the actual final value until August. Most districts probably know what that value is and can work from that at this point going forward for the rest of the year. But those who have appeals before the controller might have a different value later in the year when the final values come out. We'll talk about that process in just a minute as well. Statewide, the results were actually better than what the controller had been forecasting. The controller had forecasted about a 4% growth rate, and it actually came in at about 6%, of course, subject to some adjustment if districts appeal the results of the preliminary results of the study. Josh was kind enough to kind of put together all these slides, and he had in here this timeline for tax year 2020. Of course, the valuation is as of January of 2020. The local values, of course, get determined in the spring, leading up to a final certification in July of 2020. And then we get the controller into the act coming in December with some pre-preliminary values they released to appraisal districts prior to the actual preliminary value study, trying to clean up some of the maybe potential clerical errors, mistakes in what was submitted, that sort of thing, prior to the preliminaries that come out at the end of January. And in August of this year, we will finally get what the controller thinks the actual funding value should be from tax year 2020 that are going to be used for finalizing 2021 state aid. Now, we're in the stage right now where school districts can appeal those preliminary study values. There normally is only 40 days in which to submit an appeal. But because the recent weather had basically shut the state down for at least a week, and in some cases more than that, the controller has extended that deadline to the end of, well, close to the end of March, March 26th. So that's an extra couple of weeks basically to submit any appeal that a school district might have, asking for the controller to correct the study before they move on towards certifying in August. I'll also point out that along the way, school districts have reported those local property values to the TEA, and those were the values that were used in determining the amount of tax compression for school districts. You'll recall back in late summer, after you got certified values at the local level, TEA had the survey to get local property value information in which to calculate the district level compression of the tier 1 tax rate. You're going to repeat that process in August or late July, basically at the same time as the controller is finalizing the values for tax year 2020, but it'll be for tax year 2021. So this is a cycle that repeats. It takes well over a year to complete the entire cycle. And essentially, because of moving to current year values, you won't really have a finalized value until those certified values come out from the controller. So keep that in mind. And I think Omar will probably touch a bit on that when he talks about the template later on today. The reason it's maybe important to keep on top of this is that it seems like we're on a trend to have more school districts falling out of the category of having valid local values. We've got more and more districts hitting grace year 1 or grace year 2, and more districts getting assigned state values as a result. This can be a very significant issue. I spent about an hour on the phone earlier this week with a school district where there's probably about an 8% differential between what the controller thinks their value is versus what the school district or the appraisal district thinks their value is. And of course, state aid is calculated using the controller values. So the controller values are going to think of the district as having more tax base than they actually can get taxes from. And that's going to put the district in a bind. It also happened to be a district that for whatever reason was fast growth for the 1920 school year, but is not fast growth for 2021. And so they've lost that funding. They've lost some comp ed kids because they were funded at a higher level due to hurricane in the previous year. And it's just a layer upon layer of problems for this particular district. But one that they are really worried about is this trend of being assigned a state value as opposed to the local tax value, because that has a big impact on this particular district's state aid. So we're seeing more and more of this pop up, as you can see in the trends here. It's kind of unusual. The state had been moving in the opposite direction, having fewer and fewer districts receiving state value for many years, and now it seems to be changing in the other direction. So we'll keep an eye on that, as most of you want to do at the local level as well. Let's move on to some TEA guidance, and this is all pretty much weather related. TEA has a new waiver option. I'm sure most of you have heard of this. In the PDF associated with this presentation, there's a link down at the bottom of the page where it says document. See this document for more information. The other waiver has been created to kind of cover this catch-all of what's happened to school districts in the past couple of weeks as the storm hit. Some moved to completely remote instruction for several days, and that's essentially what this other waiver is all about. The new waiver applies in those circumstances when you were doing only remote instruction, no in-person instruction at all due to the weather. You can claim full day minutes for any of those remote days. And it only applies during the time period from February 12th until today. So if you need more days than that, if you're in a district that happened to shut down for whatever other reason, that you had frozen pipes or whatever, and you can't get them repaired, as happened in a number of school districts around the state, then you can actually get more days waived as a result of this, but you have to apply to the waiver unit and talk to them about it in more detail. For districts that had to close completely, TEAs kind of extended how you can use the missed school day waiver. You can also use that waiver, same sort of circumstances, if the power wasn't restored and you haven't been able to get the buildings opened and so forth, all the way through February 26th, possibly even longer in some special circumstances. I don't know how it was in the Valley, but there are a number of places around the state where buildings have had all sorts of dire things happen, and people's water was out for an additional week, and it's been a mess all over. But districts aren't going to be required to make up those days using the bad weather days, and the waivers don't count against the 4,200 minute cap on this missed school day waiver. This is a special circumstance, so TEA has broadened the use of this missed school day waiver to accommodate the extended period that we're dealing with in terms of the weather impact. There's new information available. This just came out yesterday. Some of this information came out yesterday. The state's under a disaster declaration. You know, the governor declared the entire state a disaster, and FEMA has declared all counties eligible for public assistance, which is the category that applies to school district expenses. Not all counties apparently are covered by the form of the disaster declaration that applies to individuals and homeowners and that sort of thing. Yesterday on the commissioner's call, there was an extended discussion of the Department of Emergency Management's tool. They're asking all school districts to try to fill out that PSTAT tool, and that's an active link in this document on the PDF, to report their damage. This is important in this circumstance because the state has a threshold for damage statewide that must be met in order for the state to maintain its eligibility. And each county also has a damage threshold that must be met. And your reporting of any damage that would be applicable for FEMA assistance will help that county meet it for its entirety. And it applies to all government entities. So if you had damage and you don't think it's all going to be covered by insurance reimbursement, then you need to report to TDIM so that you might maintain an eligibility for some FEMA assistance to cover part of that damage cost. The commissioner has some additional information that they just posted yesterday on the TEA website. Let me see here. If you go to the About TEA part under the Other Services, Weather and Disaster Information, there's 4 new documents posted as of yesterday that go into some detail about this additional assistance that's possible. If you have staff that you want to continue paying during any closure period, Josh put in this note, you need to talk to your local council on what steps you have to follow to make that happen. There's also the bullet up at the very top about these waived days counting towards meeting your 180-day requirement if you have the additional days school year program in effect in your particular district. And at the very top of this page, when you get to the PDF, there's a link to the site for more information. So let's turn now to the legislative session. We've been in session now since second week of January. We've gone about 6-7 weeks now. Things have started to happen, but quite honestly, it's been rather slow. They haven't been meeting very often, and the meetings are awkward because it's difficult to get into the Capitol. No bills have actually been heard except possibly the appropriations bill. That's the only one that's really been discussed in any committee that we watch. The House Public Education Committee has now been named, but they have yet to actually meet. They have scheduled a meeting for next Tuesday. And that's normally an organizational meeting. It's unclear whether they're going to be able to hear any bills next week. I don't think they have that scheduled, but I know that the meeting has been called. The committee has a new chair, Harold Dutton, who has been a member of the committee for quite a number of years. I don't know exactly how far back it goes. He has not been chair of this committee before. Representative Dan Huberty, who was previously chair, is still on the committee. And Mr. Dutton was interviewed yesterday by the Texas Tribune and talked about working closely with Representative Huberty on a number of issues. He had some other things to say as well regarding the possibility of extending the ADA hold harmless to the full year. That's been a subject we'll come back and talk about a little bit more in the legislative context. He actually seemed very hopeful that would happen, but it would be a legislative solution, not necessarily something the commissioner would be doing on his own. You know, Mr. Dutton, in case you don't know him, has been a member of the legislature for longer than the vast majority of House members. He's the third most senior member of the House, behind Representative Craddock, former Speaker of the House, and Symphonia Thompson. So those are the only two members with more seniority than Mr. Dutton. He's been there, this is, I think, his 17th term. So he's very experienced. He knows the legislature very well. He has a focus on education issues, along with a number of other issues as well. He's a very experienced member. New to the committee, you have a new vice chair, J.M. Lozano from Kingsville. He's the member of the committee that's closest to the Valley. The other new members, Brad Buckley from Killeen and Terry Mesa from Irving. They're noted there, kind of highlighted in green. The rest of the members are continuing to serve from the previous term. Those three new members replaced Trent Ashby, Morgan Meyer, and Scott Sanford. So there's been some turnover, not a huge amount, but some. And given Mr. Dutton's comments about working with Representative Huberty, hopefully this gets off to a good start, and they will continue down the path of polishing up House Bill 3, because I know that was an issue that Mr. Huberty said he wanted to revisit, is do some cleanup there, as well as a number of other issues. I think if you look at what the Texas Tribune says about it, I think you'll find he had a number of comments about STAR testing that he wanted to re-examine, or Chair Dutton wanted to re-examine STAR testing and a number of other issues as well. I think Josh already presented the Senate. Just put this slide in to remind you that it also has three new members, but the chair continues. Senator Taylor is still the chair. Senator Lucio is vice chair. So those folks have not yet scheduled a meeting. As of last night, I had not seen a notice that they've scheduled a meeting. The work in the Senate has been rather slow as well, but they have talked about the appropriations bill. We're going to touch on that now. So the House and Senate Finance Committees started their hearings this past week, touching on the public education appropriations. There's really no new information about the new stimulus, the $5.5 billion of, I think it's called CARISA, is the way the acronym is pronounced. And no new information in those hearings about the ADA hold harmless. What Representative Dutton or Chair Dutton said about the issue being solved by legislation was the biggest news on that subject in several weeks. The commissioner has been hinting at an answer, but hasn't been able to provide one yet about how that will be extended, or if it will be extended to cover more than just the first three reporting periods. There was a lot of discussion about internet connectivity, particularly about broadband access, and especially in the environment that we're dealing with a lot of remote instruction going on. There was a bit of concern expressed, though, especially in the Senate, about the issue of the hold harmless and how that might give districts an incentive or disincentive to follow up and get kids back in a classroom. In particular, we had Senator Huffman expressing these thoughts. What incentive is there if they're going to get paid based on hold harmless to actually go out and find kids? And are you paying for kids who aren't at a school district any longer through the hold harmless, but they're actually attending in another school district? So concerns like that have come up in the hearings, so that moves us down the road of talking a bit about attendance versus enrollment. Josh, I think, had talked to you, Connie, about this as a subject, so we wanted to incorporate some of this discussion. He's done a little bit of investigation on the subject of funding schools based on attendance versus enrollment or membership. And he's kind of categorized the pros and cons, if you will, of attendance versus enrollment. Attendance has always been seen as giving a high incentive to get students into school. Of course, right now we have a lot of barriers to students getting into school, what with COVID having really disrupted the entire educational process for the past year. The attendance compared to enrollment provides probably more of an incentive to get kids to actually participate. It does have a lower entitlement cost than enrollment if you're using the same formulas. That's an issue. Enrollment's always a higher number because of kids that don't attend. Attendance is probably a bit more complex to plan around because attendance rates vary for different reasons and different circumstances. Enrollment, though, is a little bit more consistent. However, both from a budgetary planning standpoint require you to look into the future, and the future is always an unknown to a great degree. There is significantly higher administrative burden to capture attendance every day, the way the state of Texas does it, and a much lower administrative burden just to look at enrollment. That's basically a component of your data systems. You don't have to follow up on where the kids are every single day to catch enrollment. So if you look at it on this spectrum, high administrative burden with a high incentive to attend, versus low administrative burden, but a low incentive to actually attend in person or even remotely. You see different ways of capturing attendance reflected here. Historically, the state has for probably something on the order of 30 years now, I don't remember the exact date, captured the full year of attendance, with the only exception being some school districts who have high percentages of a population of students that are migrant students. They get measured on the basis of the best 4 out of 6 6-week periods as opposed to the entire year. But back into the 80s, the state didn't measure attendance every single day, and it made a very conscious policy decision to move down that road to encourage school districts to actually get kids into school all year long. So if we were looking at changing this to a different measure, because of the difficulty of actually having in-person attendance or providing other opportunities for attendance, using enrollment would be a very significant policy change. Texas is actually somewhat at the extreme. There are only 5 states that do full year attendance as part of their funding systems. Most do some smaller periods, multiple days or multiple periods or single day, but the vast majority, 80% of the states actually use a version of membership, either on a full year basis or on some sampling basis, be it a single day or multiple days. So Texas is somewhat out of the norm with respect to this, accompanied only by California, Idaho, Kentucky, and Missouri. Finding California and Texas in the same place is what some people might call a political exception, but that's the way it is right now. Texas relies on full year ADA for most of its allotments, but it does rely on single counts for other kinds of allotments. Comp Ed has never been an attendance count. It has always been based on free or reduced lunch, and now is based on a fall snapshot. Dyslexia is another example of one of the allotments that is not an attendance-based count. It's a count, again, on a snapshot basis. And CCMR outcomes is not attendance related at all. It has to do with student performance and the outcomes for graduates. So we do have a number of counts in our system that are not attendance-based, but most of the money flows on the basis of attendance. Higher education in Texas does not use an attendance measure. It uses semester credit hours or contact hours for the most part for either the 4-year or 2-year schools. There are some additional points on community colleges for student success, sort of like the CCMR is for the K through 12 system. There are two bills. They actually are identical at this stage. The House bill was filed by Gina Hinojosa, and the Senate bill was filed by Senator Lucio. Both bills would move to using an average enrollment, and it leaves it to the commissioner to define average enrollment. They basically replace the word attendance with enrollment, throughout the education code. If that's all you were to do, both bills would have a fairly substantial cost because, as you're all aware, enrollment counts tend to be significantly higher than attendance counts. And so as a result, it would increase the cost of the foundation school program. So, when I look at that, I think, well, the legislature is probably not going to pass that without some sort of compensating adjustment. If they wanted to move down the road of having an enrollment-based system, they probably would do something like reduce the basic allotment so that the cost is more in balance with what they're spending for current law. As you're all aware, money seems to be rather tight. I kind of skipped over the Carissa issue because I wanted to touch on it now. It might be very difficult to pass bills that have any substantial cost this session, simply because the state's finances are not nearly as good as they were 2 years ago. The pandemic has really hit the revenue side of the state budget fairly hard. And so the legislature is going to be looking at things that don't cost anything more, or ways that they might be able to offset a cost with federal funds. The state is due about $5.5 billion from the latest round of stimulus funding. And a lot of people have asked me, where's that money going to go? Is it going to be added on? Is it extra? How much can we count on? Nobody really knows. And my best answer is you probably won't know until sometime the middle of April exactly how much might flow as additional funding, as opposed to a method of finance swap, kind of like the previous stimulus money ended up being. We didn't really see any net benefit from the previous stimulus funding because the state basically supplanted general revenue in the foundation school program budget. The new $5.5 billion is quite a much larger sum. We would hope that the state budget is in good enough shape that at least a fairly sizable portion of that could be additional funding to schools, particularly with all the work that school districts have been doing to accommodate the multitudes of educational environments that are now out there, the additional work of trying to find kids who have not enrolled or have not returned, to encourage more attendance in whichever form of remote or in-person attendance is appropriate for that child. So there's a whole lot of work that school districts have been doing. It'd be really nice to have a pot of money to address the needs of those kids going forward for the next couple of years, because I know everyone's very concerned about the loss of learning that's occurred as a result of the circumstances of the pandemic. One more issue that I wanted to talk about in terms of legislative is coming soon, possibly next week, or probably next week, we are going to release the Moat Casey Legislative Tracker, which you should have access to. It's a web-based application where you'll be able to look up bill summaries for different categories of legislation. We are very hopeful that this will meet a lot of your needs. If you're curious about a piece of legislation, you can go there and look up what we have to say about it, how we summarize it, so you don't have to read through the entire bill. We hope this is of significant value to you and look forward to maintaining it through the rest of the legislative session, so you know what's happening for any particular piece of legislation that you're interested in. With that, we have come to the questions section. I don't think
I've seen any, Joe. And please, folks, if you want to unmute or if you want to chat your question or even comments, because comments can really get us going too. Uh, Joe, I'm just kind of, and I'm going to start while people warm up and decide on their questions. But even this morning, as I'm watching some news, it's I think the new stimulus bill is going to be voted out of the House today, hopefully. And so, of course, they say, and money is coming to the schools and so forth. And so I'm just kind of curious, even based on our discussion of what other states are doing, did everybody use the ESSER to supplant? Because they really should restate that and just say, we're sending money to the states to decide what they're going to do with the dollars. And I say that because, as you mentioned just very quickly and just a little earlier, the districts didn't see $1 benefit. And please correct me, my colleagues, if I'm wrong. $1 benefit to the ERSER funds. And not only that, it created quite a bit of administrative work and training work and revised work and and timing work. Accounting work, it was a bit nightmarish. And again, anyone can disagree with me if they'd like. I'd be okay with that. I'll pause.
I'm not going to disagree with you. I think that's a very accurate assessment of it, and it actually, was not equally distributed in terms of its additional workload. Districts that had high populations of low-income students were the ones who had the most work to do as a result of how that was flowed and how the grant was restricted. I have seen one report that said only Texas and New York used the ESSER solely as a supplant. All other states, at least some of the ESSER money was additional funding. And, coming as it did in the circumstances, it was very unfortunate that the state could not provide additional support to school districts. But that in part was because all they could do was issue it as a grant in the terms under which it was to be granted. It's not like the stimulus that we had back in the 2010, 2009, where they could actually appropriate it as part of the method of finance to kind of ease that burden. That's not how this one worked. And it would be nice, as you said, if they would just give the money to the state and say, here, state, go about your business, but that's not how the federal appropriators decided to do it. They decided to issue it as a grant for specific purposes. The $5.5 billion, I'm not going to claim to be an expert in the Carissa funds. I think it has some of the same sort of strings attached, but not quite as rigorous. There is an opportunity for it to be used, in a more thoughtful way by the legislature. And so that's, I think, part of why you haven't seen anything come out about here's how we're going to do this is the legislature has at least an ability to deal with this in a little bit more, a little less burdensome way, if you will. But I would hope that, given that the state's budget problem was only about $7 billion in terms of the shortfall, when the controller did the revenue estimate back in January, I would hope that we have an opportunity with $5.5 billion for a significant share of that to be additional money. As I said, I think there is a concern that there are a lot of kids who are going to need a lot of additional assistance all over the state. And so being able to use that money to address those needs in a more thoughtful way at the school district level would be very useful, as opposed to just having additional paperwork burden and no additional money as a result. So like I said, I think it'll be some time before we see where everything lands. Probably around April, once they put all the budget pieces together, uh, with whatever cuts they're going to apply to different agencies and whatever revenue adjustments the controller comes up with, it's going to take some more time to work this out. And they've only started just this past week.
And really my first choice is that the feds give the money directly flow through to the districts. I mean, and not have the state be the middleman or middle person.
Even if it's restricted in how you can use it, you'd rather have it flow directly to the school districts.
Yeah. Or call it what it is. It's for state use purposes, like I mentioned. Yeah. And do the legislators, thank you for reminding us again who on slide, I think it was 14 and 15, who's on the public ed committees, both for the House and the Senate. Do they fully understand what happened? Because sometimes, sometimes I get the impression that they really think that there were new monies and there really weren't new monies. So do they, do the folks, especially the new members, but even existing members,
Yeah, I think, that there is an awareness among those who work most closely with public education that there really wasn't any new money to be had. The appropriators are a different group. The folks on the Finance and the House Appropriations Committee are, much larger committees for one, and don't always have the details of every program in mind among all the members. It will be interesting to work through this with the Senate forms working groups, if you will. The House has kind of subcommittees that deal with different articles. As they go through the details and talk about this, it will be interesting for members on those two committees to actually hear the stories of school districts in terms of the additional work burden that the ESSER funds created for the no additional net benefit. I think the folks on the public education and education committees probably have heard that quite a bit from their constituent school districts, because they're much more in touch with school districts than the folks on the appropriations committee tend to be. The appropriations committee probably looks at it more like, well, is there any other source of funds that we can use to offset general revenue, because we don't have enough general revenue to pay the bills. But you have to have some balance there, and hopefully that balance comes out in the working groups of those two committees, which are, again, just getting started.
Yeah, I had colleagues share with me, but it wasn't an option. It was like, just keep the ESSER money and give me my state money. But that wasn't an option. You had to take the ESSER money because it was going to be subtracted from your state money, whether you took it or not, type of thing. So
yeah, and it was I shouldn't go there. I shouldn't say those sort of things in a public meeting. It was a significant challenge to be told you have to get this money, and it's supposed to be for holding you harmless for what happened when schools shut down for 2 months. And school districts didn't shut down because they thought that was great educationally. They shut down because they had to for health and safety reasons. And they worked really, really hard to try to address the needs of kids during that time period in a very awkward system. It wasn't their fault. They actually incurred more expense to do all of that. And yet they get rewarded with something that, nominally was to cover some of the cost of the 2 months or 2 reporting periods of shutdown, and it had nothing to do directly with those costs or even the ADA that was being made up. I mean, it seems all just kind of an excuse to use the money rather than any assistance to school districts. And certainly if school districts were only funded for the ADA that actually happened in person last year, it would have been a disaster for everyone. There would have been massive layoffs. There would have been, the bankruptcies of school districts statewide. But that didn't happen, and the legislature wasn't that short, and it could have covered the cost even without ESSER. But they could see around the corner that there was a big fiscal problem coming, and that's what forced them into that position. So enough said about that. Any other questions or issues?
I did notice towards the end of the call yesterday that the commissioner, on the commissioner's call, there was a hint of possibly even a meeting next week instead of in a couple of weeks or soon, to maybe announce something related to the hold harmless, or at least that's what I hoped he was leaning towards.
Yeah, and
that'll
that,
be,
yeah, I heard that comment as well. I didn't listen to the whole call, just part of it. But Representative Dutton was fairly definitive in thinking that this was going to be a solution on the legislative end for the hold harmless, which was kind of surprising. That was news. No one had been talking about waiting on legislation. Legislation is not likely to pass until May, and school districts want to know what's going to happen. You need a little bit more certainty for the rest of the year to figure out, okay, are we really, really in trouble? Because there are a lot of school districts I've seen attendance data for the first semester, and it's not very pretty. There's going to be a big funding gap if that attendance can't improve in the second semester. And here we are a month into that. Well, not actually, a month and a half or so since school districts went back to school. And then we have the winter storm and all of what it's doing. Some kids probably still have problems with their living conditions. They've been displaced. It's a real bad year. We thought 2020 was bad enough, and so hopefully this gets better from here on out. But I'm not going to give a guarantee.